Hey guys, here is a PowerPoint presentation about exposure controls, apertures, shutter speeds, ISO. Okay, this is where we're going. Okay, so apertures. Okay, so this is the lens opening, right? We can call it the lens aperture, as I say there. It controls the amount of light passing through the lens. Right, the actual mechanism that's doing that is called the diaphragm. Right? I should have that in here. I don't. But okay. The lens opening is expressed in numbers like what you see here. I have the conventional numbers are f2.8, f3.5, f4.5. Right. Why would you want to know those? Well, let's say you pick up a camera you've never used before and you're trying to figure out what's what. If you see 11, and you know this stuff, you'll know it's an aperture. It's not an ISO. It's not a shutter speed. Right. The numbers are kind of strange. They're the result of a calculation that has to do with the lens diameter and the focal length and things like that. So these are actually one-stop changes from one to the next. Right. That's if I go from f11 to f16. I've made a one-stop change. I probably have this in an upcoming slide, but I guess I'll just say this. Each one of these is a stop, and with every stop, you're either doubling or decreasing the light. You're doubling it or you're halving it. So if I go from f8 to f5.6, I'm actually doubling the amount of light that passes through the lens. If I go from f8 to f11, I'm cutting it in half. Okay. That's what one stop is. It's a factor of 2, meaning the light passing through the lens is either doubled or it's halved. Of course, with our cameras, we can do fractions of stops. Like I have my camera set up to do 1/3 stops for every click on the dial that controls the lens opening. And probably yours too, you can set it up for half stops or third stops. All right. But a full stop is either doubling or it's halving the amount of light. Right? So it says a change of one stop results in either doubling or halving. Right? Changing the lens setting from a larger number to a smaller number by one stop doubles the amount of light passing through the lens. So it's a little counterintuitive. You're going from 11 to 8, right? A bigger number to a smaller number, but if you do that in one stop increment, you're doubling the amount of light. Okay. I think that has to do with it being a fraction, but it's been a while since I've studied that stuff. So okay, just in terms of naming things, we can call these apertures. We can call them f-stops. Okay. When you say the aperture, you're talking about the opening of the lens. If I make the aperture bigger, I'm making the f-stop smaller, right? So something like f2.8, the lens is nearly wide open, if not wide open. I have a lens and the maximum aperture is f2.8. The lens is wide open, okay? The aperture is large. The f-stop is small. And conversely, if I'm at f16, 16 is a big number, but the opening of the lens is small. Okay, so it's a little counterintuitive there. Okay, why do you want to have control over the light passing through the lens? Well, you want to control it because you're shooting in different types of lighting, different amounts of lighting, right? That's one reason. Another reason is what I have highlighted here, depth of field. Right? Changing the f-stop also affects the depth of field apparent in the image. The distance between the thing nearest to the camera that's in focus and the thing that's farthest away from the camera that's in focus. That's my simple definition of depth of field. Depth of field is the distance between the closest thing in focus and the furthest thing in focus. Okay, so it's a little confusing again because you can have your lens set at 6 feet. Right? And your lens will be in focus at 6 feet. The image will be in focus at 6 feet. But if you stop the lens down, meaning you're going to f8, f11, the opening of the lens gets smaller and more foreground comes into focus and more background comes into focus. Okay? So shooting with the lens wide open creates a shallow depth of field. Focusing on something close up will tend to create this effect as well. Right? So if I have a lens, and even if I have the lens quote unquote stopped down to like f11, f16, which would typically give me a lot of depth of field, but if I'm focused on something that's only 15 inches in front of me, I'm going to have shallow depth of field. Okay, so focus also affects this phenomena of depth of field. So this picture, it's a little bit deceiving, but it's showing you what depth of field looks like. You've seen it probably, and if you've done some photography, you're probably well aware of this. But so here's the one in focus, and that's out of focus, right? Why do you want to control that? Well, you can direct the viewer's attention to something that's in focus. We're more likely to look at sharp things than out of focus things. So we can create a center of attention, a focal point in a picture, right? So you're directing the viewer's attention around a picture. Okay, and I have that depicted here with this image of somebody's gargantuan dinner table, not mine, right? And you can see it's a lot of stuff to look at, right? And it can be overwhelming if everything is in focus, right? But with this going out of focus, the viewer's eye is kind of in this realm here. This picture also kind of talks about something called hyperfocal distance, but that's a little bit difficult to explain here. I'm going to not get into it too much, but maybe you can do a search for it if you're interested in hyperfocal distance. But I'll reiterate here. Closing down the lens, going from a bigger aperture, say f5.6, to a smaller aperture, like f16, will increase the depth of field, right? And what's the good reason for doing that? You direct a viewer's attention, for one thing, right? And reiterating again, right? And you're getting this in your readings, too, right? So Ben Long goes over this in the book. Again, if you're familiar with how cameras work, you might know this, but there's a good chance it's new to you. Even if you have a DSLR, you might have been focusing, not really thinking about depth of field. Okay, this is a diagram showing you again, f2.8, the lens is very wide open. f16, the lens is closed down, right? With the lens closed down, you get a lot of depth of field, like the picture over here on the right. With shallow depth of field, right, I can say I really want the viewer to look at this kid, and these other figures in the picture are kind of like just bookends or context, right? Okay. It's also showing this diagram. This is an old school lens, but lenses, believe it or not, used to come with aperture rings. Some of them still do, and they also used to come with depth of field scales, and that's what you're seeing here. But this illustration is kind of showing you what depth of field looks like. It's the closest thing to the camera that's in focus, and the furthest thing that's in focus. You can have shallow depth of field, you can have deep depth of field. Okay, more examples of what this looks like. Okay, this is admittedly a picture I grabbed off the web, but here, and it's kind of rough, I have to say. The guy in this picture here, he's relatively sharp. It's a little bit pixelated because it's a low-res image. The building is out of focus, right? Here, the building is in focus. The guy's out of focus. How do you do that? A lot of it can be done with depth of field without changing your lens opening. Same thing going on here, right? And this is also talking about how focal length of lens affects depth of field, right? So a telephoto lens designed to photograph something far away has more shallow depth of field, right? So even despite apertures, lens opening, a telephoto lens will have shallower depth of field than like what's called a normal lens or a wide-angle lens. Okay, all right. So just to reiterate before I go into shutter speeds, apertures, f-stops, they control the lens opening, right? All right, and aperture is the actual opening. F-stop is the setting that the lens is set to, for opening. Small numbered f-stops equal big openings of the lens, right? So 2.8, 1.8, that's going to be wide open, a lot of light coming through the lens. 16, 22, f16, f22. That's a small opening, little light coming through the lens. Shutter speeds. Okay, the conventional numbers for shutter speeds are 1 second, half a second, quarter of a second, eighth of a second, 1/15th of a second. Then you notice that probably on your camera, like on my camera, they're expressed in whole numbers. I know that there are some DSLRs out there that will show you these as fractions, and will even, as you change, speaking of apertures, it'll change. I've seen some cameras that have a little diagram on the LCD. When you change your aperture, it's actually showing you what's going on there. Right? But these are whole numbers here, but only because they don't want to take up a bunch of space on your camera showing you what the shutter speed is. They presume that you know that these are actually fractions. So these numbers are actually fractions, like 1/60th of a second, 1/125th of a second. They're shown as whole numbers to simplify and shrink the display. Some cameras display the fraction, like on the LCD on the back. But most cameras I've used just show these as whole numbers. Okay, so it's 1 second, and our cameras too today, will go up to 10,000th. I don't know what my fastest shutter speed. Very fast, and in the opposite direction, very slow. Right, the longest exposure time we have in our cameras probably is 30 seconds. Right. Okay, down to this little bit here. Changing from a large number like 500 to a smaller number like 60 means that you're opening up, quote unquote, by how many stops is the question. 500 is, you go, if I go from 500 to a 60, means I'm going, we call these stops as well. I'm going 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops. Okay, so this is 3 stops. Okay, like the f-stops I talked about earlier, we see these as whole stops, 1/60th, 1/25th, 1/250th, right? And also, like your apertures, when you roll the dial that changes your shutter speed, it's probably changing your shutter by not whole stops. Each click is equal to either 1/2 or 1/3 of a stop. And again, you set that in the menu of your camera, right? I personally have mine set at 1/3 stops. So every little click on my shutter speed dial equals 1/3 of a stop. But whole stops, just like with the f-stops, are either doubling or halving the length of time that the sensor is getting exposure. Okay? It's important to know that because ultimately in a slide or two here I'll talk about how if you change one and you don't change the other, you will change what's called the exposure value. Okay, so you want to know, if I open up my lens 2 stops and I want to keep the exposure the same, or the exposure value, if I open up the lens 2 stops, I need to, in a sense, close down the shutter 2 stops, meaning make the shutter faster. Right? As the shutter gets faster, the sensor is exposed to less light. So if I let more light through the lens, I want to cut the amount of time the sensor is exposed to that light. Right? If I'm trying to maintain a normal exposure, quote unquote. Okay. So using a slow shutter speed allows movement to become blurred. Right? That's a really good thing. If you want to show, in this case, like people running, having frozen figures, it freezes the image. It takes some of the energy away. Right? Having that blur indicates like, oh, these people are actually moving. So this is one of the reasons why you want to have control over the shutter speed, not just to compensate for the lens opening, but to use it for an effect. I want some blurriness, or I'm photographing something very high speed. Maybe it's a bird flying, maybe it's a car race or something like that, and I don't want the blur. I want to shoot with a very fast shutter speed, 1,000th, 2,000th of a second, something like that. So I want control over these things, the lens and the shutter. Right? Okay, what I was trying to explain just a minute ago, if I say like, oh, I'm going to change my lens opening. Like right now I have the correct exposure setting with my camera, and by the way, you can determine that with the exposure scale in your camera, and if you don't know where that is or what I'm talking about, look in your manual. It's a little, like, in a sense, like a scale with a 0 in the middle, and you want to get that to the middle, typically. Okay, if you have got your exposure set to a normal exposure and you decide all of a sudden, hey, I want to open up my lens 2 stops to get shallower depth of field, well, if you do that, you need to compensate for that change by speeding up the shutter 2 stops, right? So these things work in conjunction with each other, right? They have a reciprocal relationship to each other. If I open up the lens, I need to close down the shutter. And I'm talking here about using your camera in the manual mode. If you use it in one of the auto modes for your camera, it's going to do that automatically, right? And there are problems with that too. But okay, suffice to say, if you have taken a picture and you have what looks like a normal exposure, and now you just decide you want to speed up the shutter speed or slow it down, and you do that, but you don't change the lens opening, you're going to get the incorrect exposure. Okay. Okay, if you choose a higher shutter speed like 1/500th of a second or 1,000th of a second, you can freeze motion, right? Like I just mentioned. Okay, why do you want to use a slower shutter speed? Like I just mentioned, blur can be to your advantage. It expresses movement, expresses the energy of a city, for instance, right? Okay, ISO. Okay, we've gone over apertures, shutter speeds, and ISO. These are the 3 main controls for exposure in your camera. ISO. It actually stands for International Standards Organization, right? And it refers to the sensitivity of the sensor. In film days, in analog, it refers to the sensitivity of film, right? For us, in digital, it refers to the sensor. And basically what you're doing is changing the amplification of the signal being generated by the light sensor in your camera. So the light sensor is made up of a bunch of light-sensitive diodes we call pixels, and as they're struck by light, they generate electricity. Right? They generate electrical impulse. And as you turn your ISO dial up, you're amplifying that signal. The conventional ISO numbers are 50 so-and-so for digital. Depends on what camera you've got, but 100, 200, 400, 800, right? I stop here at 6400, but my camera goes up to tens of thousands. Yours probably does too, right? Right. So if you notice, kind of like shutter speeds, these are all one-stop increments, and as I change from 200 to 400, basically I'm multiplying 200 to get 400, right? Just like the other features, the aperture and the shutter speed, one-stop increments equal a doubling or a halving of the amount of exposure that you get. So if I change ISO from 800 to 400, I've just decreased the sensitivity of the sensor by one stop, right? If I do that, if I change ISO by one stop, I need to, if I want to keep the same exposure, change either the lens opening or the shutter speed to compensate for that. To be honest with you, I don't change ISO all the time, right? I go out for a shoot, if it's a sunny day, I know that I can have my ISO anywhere from, keep it 200, 400, right? And then I forget about it, and I just deal with shutter speeds and apertures, right? I don't really bump up ISO unless I'm in a low light situation and I need to, or even, twilight, late afternoon, in the shade, maybe I need to bump up the ISO. But this is not something I change nearly as much, by far, as I do with lens opening and shutter speed, right? But the fact is that these 3 things interact with one another, right? That they all contribute to your exposure, right? So I say here, what's the trade-off? I don't know if I have my next slide in here. Well, a higher ISO can be used for low light situations when slow shutter speeds or wide lens openings can't do the job. So you bump up your ISO. What's the trade-off? Once you start to get up around, depending on what camera you've got, 1600, 3200, 6400, you start to get a visible amount of noise in your picture, right? And some of that can be taken out in Photoshop. And what happens when you do that too is you lose some detail in the picture. It becomes a little bit smudgy. So there's a compromise with shooting in high ISO. But I mean, if the only way you can get a picture is by bumping up your ISO to 3000 or something, you do that, right? Um, right? It's better to have a picture. And you could make the argument like, hey, I really want the noise. You know, it works for this picture. All right. So these three controls, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, are the controls that affect exposure. Understanding what they can accomplish gives you more control over your images. Shooting in manual allows you to control all of these factors, right? But sometimes you don't need to control all, or you may be photographing in a standard situation that allows for some automation to be used. Okay, I'm going to stop this video right here because it'll get too big. Okay, so this portion of the video is just about those three controls, right? Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Understand how to operate them, understand how they're interrelated, right? The fact that they have what you could call an indirect relationship. If I open up one, I got to close down the other, and vice versa, that kind of thing, okay? Review the book. So you have various ways to understand this stuff through this presentation, through the book, and through your own practice, okay? All right.